to 9.8%, rose by 0.7%. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics have been expecting it to rise by 1.1% as people step down from the Christmas season to the post-Christmas doldrums. And so because the unemployment rate rose by only 0.7 percentage points, 0.4 percentage points less than they had been expecting from the seasonal movement, they reported that adjusting for the seasonal factor, that the unemployment picture actually became quite a bit better, a significant fall in the unemployment rate. Puzzling thing about that is that there's another survey, a survey of businesses, which counts how many people businesses have on their payrolls. And the fall in the unemployment rate reported by households isn't matched by a rise in the employment number of workers employed reporting by businesses. And those two series should go together. They don't always for reasons having to do with measurement error, with mistakes in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, ability to figure out how many firms there actually are, et cetera, et cetera. We're kind of watching this closely. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. You've got this Say's law. Why is it that the claim that there's always enough demand in the economy to employ everybody? That if there are some industries, say making lattes, in which there's excess, which is deficient demand, there'll be others like offering yoga lessons where there is excess demand, where businesses are frantically looking for people to work in them. And the answer is that people want to spend their money not just on currently produced goods and services, but on financial assets. And when a huge number of people get into their heads that they want to accumulate more financial assets and spend less on currently produced goods and services, if the economy gets into trouble, you know the single equation you should most often to analyze economic growth. Let's skip that. We've already done a bunch of problems. And now we finally get on to depression economics, which once again starts from Say's law, or rather from the fact that Say's law fails. Back in 1803, when Jean-Baptiste Say got into this economics business, he said that it could not be the case that sales are dull owing to the scarcity of money. And we would interpret scarcity of money today to be the same thing as excess demand for financial assets. Instead, Jean-Baptiste Say said, if sales are low, it's because people aren't producing things efficiently. And he said, should the increase of traffic of sales require more money to facilitate it, the want is easily supplied, because merchants know well enough how to find substitutes for the product serving as the medium of exchange or money. That is, if you want to buy something from somebody, and if you don't have cash on hand, if for some reason government hasn't printed enough dollar bills for you to have your share, well then whoever you're buying it from will usually be extremely anxious to extend you credit in normal times. Let's say you want to buy this car, okay, as long as you're willing to enter into a consumer credit contract, we'll lend you the money to buy the car. We trust that you'll be good for it, and besides we have repo men who can take the car back if you don't pay. This is a good business decision for us. And indeed we'd say most of the time, Say is correct. Most of the time, if there's a shortage of financial assets in the economy, then private businesses will be eager to do something to create more financial assets. That the auto company, the General Motors Assistance Corporation, will go out into the marketplace and tell the bank saying, hey, we need more money to make car loans. And the banks will look around and they'll look at their customers and they'll tell their customers they have a once-in-a-lifetime savings opportunity. And so the savings will get diverted to the General Motors Assistance Corporation, which will issue a certificate of indebtedness to the people who give it its savings, will issue its own bonds. And that money will then flow through into the auto companies, and lo and behold, you'll have made the extra financial assets that people need in order to carry out the transactions that they want. Not always. It didn't happen in 1829. Right? In 1829, the Bank of England found that all of a sudden a lot of people were worried that the banknotes it had issued weren't very good. There had been an enormous boom in Britain over the previous 9 years. All kinds of people had been starting all kinds of canal companies and all kinds of textile companies and digging big holes in the ground throughout England with the idea that then people will float barges on them and will collect tariffs from barges and make a lot of money. People were worried that the canal sector had been overbuilt and maybe a whole bunch of these canals wouldn't produce any profits at all. And people said, hold it, we're not so sure about these Bank of England notes we've been holding in our vaults. We'd rather have gold. So they took their banknotes and they went to the Bank of England and they said, we want gold coins or gold bars. We don't want these notes. We're not confident that you, Bank of England, are too big to fail. That's what specie means in this context. Actual, real gold. And so the Bank of England, finding that when people were bringing its banknotes in faster than it could print them and asking for gold, and not having a great deal of excess gold in its vaults, simply stopped issuing banknotes, which meant that it stopped buying bonds from businesses in exchange for its banknotes, which meant that a whole bunch of businesses that had been expecting that they would be able to borrow cash from the Bank of England in exchange for giving the Bank of England title to their next week's sales or the week after that sales couldn't do so. And as their own debts became due, they were forced to meet them because they couldn't do their normal borrowing. And then you get a financial crisis and you get a depression. Selling goods for half of what they cost in an attempt to raise cash, multitude of workers without work, many bankruptcies declared. That's what happened in 1829. That's the story that we've been telling over and over again ever since, that there's a financial crisis. And so financiers and firms get scared that the debts owed to them won't be repaid, and get scared that the debts that they owe will not get rolled over. And so financiers and firms stop spending as much on currently produced goods and services as they try to build up their larger cash reserves to deal with the large numbers of people coming to them and demanding that they pay their debts in cash they expect to have happen. And as they stop spending, inventories of unsold goods rise. All over the economy, a whole bunch of things that have been produced with the idea that people would spend to buy them pile up in extra inventories. And then as businesses see their inventories rise, businesses start firing people so that their inventories of unsold goods don't rise any higher. But the people who are then fired lose their jobs. And as they lose their jobs, they lose their incomes, and they then stop spending as well. This is the story of depression economics. What are the cures? Well, there are potentially 3 cures. The first is that if the private sector won't spend, you can have the government buy stuff directly. That after all, the government is too big to fail, or at least is supposed to be too big to fail. And even if there's not enough demand for currently produced goods and services elsewhere in the economy, the government can step in. Of course, recently we found out the governments of Iceland, Greece, and Ireland are definitely not too big to fail, and they can't buy because no one trusts their promises. The rest governments, though, are still okay. You can have the government flood the zone with cash. This is what the Bank of England actually did during the financial crisis of 1825 and 1826, with the idea that if the central bank, if the government simply floods the economy with cash, Nobody is scared they won't have enough cash to pay off their debts. Instead, people will say, hey, look, we have all this cash. We should spend it on something useful. It's not doing us any good sitting here in our vaults. We could do much better with it if we bought something useful with it. That's number 2. Number 3 is to get the confidence fairy to show up, to get businesses eager to spend their cash yet again. And it's something that governments always try to do in a financial crisis and a downturn. We saw President Obama do it yesterday when he went to the Chamber of Commerce and asked the businessmen of America to take some of the cash they've been hoarding and spend it on buying stuff. It's pretty humiliating. Most humiliating came during the Great Depression when Herbert Hoover was wandering around asking businesses to spend, saying, if you spend, then prosperity will be just around the corner. These are all 3 things that you can do to deal with a depression. We're going to try to ascertain how effective each of them is likely to be, as well as calculate how large a depression is likely to be. And so we're going to build an economic model, a very different model, as I said before, than the solo growth model we have been using. So stop thinking about the solo growth model, except for limited times when you have to do economic growth over the next several weeks, while we do depression economics, while we build up what's called the Keynesian income expenditure model. And it's a very simple model. It says that there are just 4 sets of main actors in the economy. There are importers and exporters on the one hand. There's a government that buys stuff on the second hand. On the third hand, there are businesses that want to build new factories. And last, there are households busy buying consumption goods. And all 4 of these flows of spending come from different places, and all 4 of them add up to total aggregate demand for currently produced goods and services. And in order to understand when and why you're in a situation of high unemployment, you need to be able to calculate aggregate demand in the economy and compare it to the economy's productive capacity. And we're going to do more than simply draw stick figures and arrows. We're going to do some algebra for this model. And in order to do the algebra, you need to know one thing, and that thing is that the letter Y in this model stands for lots of things. That the letter Y stands for the economy-wide incomes received by households. It stands for the level of production by firms. It stands for the level of spending by households and businesses and importers and exporters and by the government. And it stands for all of them, by the circular flow principle, by which everyone's production, everyone's spending is used to buy someone's production, and every act of production is then used to pay someone, is then a cause for businesses to pay somebody's income, and every dollar of income is then going to be spent by some final demander on something. And so we have consumption spending by households, investment spending by businesses, government purchases, and then our net exports, equal to gross exports, that is total exports, minus imports. Those are the 7, I guess, quantities that we're going to want to keep control of and keep track of. And we're going to start with the observation that consumption spending plus investment spending plus government purchases plus net exports, those add up to total aggregate demand. Those add up to spending, to production, and to incomes. And we'll usually want to write not net exports, but rather gross exports minus imports for that portion of aggregate demand. And then we're going to want to set down some rules for what determines these particular flows. Most of the time, we'll just say that gross exports are kind of out there, that that's how much foreigners want to buy of things produced in the United States. And that will depend on the level of the exchange rate and the level of demand in foreign countries and on how good are the products we're making and a whole bunch of other things. But generally, for much of the time, it's simply going to be something that's determined outside the country, or at least outside the country plus and in the foreign exchange markets, and that what happens inside this country doesn't have big feedbacks on it. Similarly, the government buys what it buys for it because of the way its political processes work out. There's no big immediate feedback from what else is going on in the economy to government purchases. In business investment spending, well, that depends on what goes on in financial markets and on how optimistic businesses are. But once again, there's not a great deal of feedback from the level of GDP on the one hand to business investment spending on the other. There's a little bit of feedback. If we were using my teacher Olivier Blanchard's textbook rather than mine and Marty Olney's, he'd talk a bunch about the feedback there is. Here I'm just going to assume it's 0 simply to make things simpler. There is feedback in 2 important places. The first is in consumption spending. When households' incomes fall, they're going to stop spending as much on buying stuff. They're going to slow down their consumption spending on currently produced goods and services. And so we say that each dollar by which incomes change are going to change consumption spending by some amount less than a dollar. Call it this particular parameter C sub y. C, lowercase c, because it's in the consumption equation. Lowercase y, because it tells us what the influence of incomes y is on consumption spending C. And then in front of that term, we put a little C0, a consumer confidence term, that tells us what consumer confidence is going to be as a function of what consumer confidence is going to be and its impact on consumption spending. And actually, let me change that. For this course, let's see if we can pull out. Yeah, I'm going to want to write this differently. I'm going to want to write this as y minus t, where t are the taxes that the government collects, the federal government in this case, which is then going to be equal to C0 cy times 1 minus t times y. With the idea that the government has a kind of stable and simple tax system, and collects simply a fraction t, lowercase t, of all income, and collects that in taxes. So in order to figure out what consumption spending is going to be, you have to take the total level of income in the economy, y. You have to multiply it by 1 minus t to get the total disposable income of households, how much income households get that then is not taxed away. Then you have to multiply it by this cy, by this marginal propensity to consume factor, and then add to it this baseline consumer confidence C0. That's going to give us consumption spending. That's going to give us a formula for consumption spending that depends on consumer confidence, on the tax rate, on how much leeway consumers have in their spending, how much they feel they have to cut back on their consumption spending when incomes fall, and on the total level of income in the economy. And it's a very simple equation, but it's an equation that allows us to keep track of a bunch of things that influence consumption spending, a bunch of things that matter. If you read the daily news, daily financial news, you'll find a lot of attention is devoted, say, to surveys of consumer confidence, devoted to that because people think that tells you something about what this parameter is. And if you're investing or planning a business, you really would like to have as much input, as much of a clue as you can to what's happening to consumer confidence because it affects consumption spending. We're also going to say that imports are a constant fraction of incomes. that the share of our total spending we spend on imported goods goes up and down when income goes up and down as well. And note once again that these y's are standing for two different things. The two y's down here are incomes, the incomes of households. The y up here is spending and production. They're the same thing by the circular flow principle. If they're not the same thing, they're going to be the same thing very quickly. The fact that everyone's spending is someone's production becomes someone's income guarantees it. And the fact that income is the same as spending and as production is what allows even a small effect, a small change in investment, to have potentially a bigger effect on the level of total production in the economy. So then we want to go for a little bit more algebra, say. We start with our equation for the level of spending. We notice that we have an equation for consumption spending, and we have an equation for imports. And we can substitute these two equations in. This one in here for where consumption spending is, this one in here for imports. And then we have an equation which has a bunch of y's in it. Since we're going to want to solve for y, since we're going to want to figure out what aggregate demand is in this economy, we're then going to want to move all the terms with y's in them to the left-hand side, which we can do. And we're then going to want to divide by the coefficient in front of y in this equation to get this particular equation here, which is our counterpart for depression economics of our magic central growth equation. Practically everything you probably do will want you to use this equation at some point in time. What does it say? Well, it says the level of expenditure, of aggregate demand, of output, of spending, of incomes in the economy, y. That's going to be equal to the quotient of two things. The first is this numerator. I call it autonomous spending. Sometimes I think I'll use the letter A for it. It's that part of spending that really doesn't change very much when income and production changes. It depends on the baseline level of consumption spending, which depends on how confident consumers are. It depends on business investment spending, which depends on what's going on in financial markets and how exuberant businessmen are. It depends on government purchases, which are produced by the political system. It depends on gross exports, which are determined by foreigners' taste for domestically made goods. You take those four things and you add them up together, and then you divide them. You then divide them by 1 minus, and here we have 1 minus the tax rate. Here we have the marginal propensity to consume. Here we have the marginal propensity to import. This gives us an equation for how to calculate y, how to calculate the level of demand in an economy. Where does this equation come from? Well, it comes from the fact that we have our four components of aggregate demand: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. But that a bunch of those components of aggregate demand also depend on the level of income. Let's suppose consumption spending rises, and you'd think that would lead production, spending, production, and incomes to rise. But as spending, production, and incomes rise, well, households feel more flush, they have more cash on hand, and so they increase their consumption spending even more. How much do they increase their consumption spending? Well, in the first round, they increase it by 1 minus t, by the change in their disposable income, times their marginal propensity to consume. That extra increase in consumption spending coming from not just from the initial increase in consumer confidence, but from the fact that households now have more money flowing into their pockets. That's what produces this term here in the denominator. And this term here, this IMY term, this comes from the fact that a whole bunch of demand is going to leak out to other countries. That households are going to spend more, yes, but a bunch of that spending will be on imports. And so that spending will go to create demand for production and for labor and for incomes in Europe, in Mexico, in Brazil, in China. Not so much here. Now, normally, in a normal year, back before we had this big downturn, if this were back in 2007, I would say that investment in the United States economy was going along at $2 trillion per year. That government purchases were $2.5 trillion. That gross exports were $1.7 trillion. That the marginal propensity to consume, this CY term in our consumption function, was 0.5. That our marginal propensity to import was 0.15. And that our federal tax rate, which is what matters here at the margin, is 0.2. And that our consumer confidence-related term was $3.9 trillion a year. Think of that as how much households would want to spend even if they had no incomes at all. It won't be the case that households ever have no incomes at all, but if there were, that's kind of what they'd like to spend. Knowing that, what's Y going to be? Well, if you have all these parameter values, you can then calculate the denominator. You got a 1 at the start. You got a 1, oops, that's wrong. That needs to be minus 0.02, not minus 0.08. 1 minus 0.02 times 0.5 plus 0.15 equals 0.75 for the denominator. Our numerator is 2 plus 2.5 plus 1.7 plus 3.9 equals 2.1, equals 10.1. And so we have 10.1 divided by 0.75. Dividing something by 0.75 is the same thing as multiplying it by 1.33. That's why this is called the multiplier model. Devised as it was by Richard Kahn in Cambridge, England, back in the early 1930s. 10.1 times 1.33 gives you 13.5 trillion. That's dead on for what GDP was in the United States, for what output spending and production and incomes were for the United States back in the spring of 2008. 13.5 trillion. That's what this model's good for. So in our little Keynesian model, what does our C going to stand for? Yep, consumption, that's good. We don't get anyone saying capital, and this is the reason we used K for capital rather than C back in the growth theory part. We didn't want confusion. It doesn't stand for credit. We don't usually have a good letter for credit in this model. C stands for consumption. It's by far the biggest piece of GDP. What does Y stand for?